Hello everybody, I'm Nick, and in this video I'm going to talk about the biggest mistake that most people make when it comes down to testing applications that are using anti-framework or anti-framework core. Now this issue is so common that when I travel around the world running my workshop on testing, I see most people make it. And many people do not understand that it is bad, and only the ones that have actually had an issue eventually in their applications are the ones that figured out how to fix it. So in this video, I'm going to explain what the problem is, why it is that bad, why it basically renders your tests meaningless, and how you can fix it. If you like our content and you want to see more, make sure you subscribe for more training. Check out my courses on dometrain.com. Okay, so let me show you what I have here. I have a simple application over here, a customer's API. It is a controller-based API, and it's more of a REST API. So we have our create customers, get a customer by ID, get all customers, update a customer, and then delete a customer. Now, none of this is fundamentally important, but the important thing is here in the service. So in the service, I'm using anti-framework for my database. So I'm injecting the DB context, and then all the customers are here in this DB context. Now, everything you see here is pretty common, pretty bog standard, but what I want to focus on is how you would go about integration testing this application. So this is a .NET 7 application. It has a program.cs, nothing out of the ordinary, exactly what you would do. And in this example also, I'm using Postgres as my database provider. So nothing special over here. As you can see, we have a connection string in the app settings.json, and that is it. Now, I've already created my test project over here. I'm going to go here and show you my integration tests. Now, these tests are using something called the Web Application Factory, or the WAF. And all the WAF is doing is it's creating a real version of my application, but it's an in-memory version. So I can't really call it through the network. The only way I can call it is by using this special HTTP client that I'm getting out of the create client call of the WAF. The test itself is very simple. For example, I'm using Bogus here to generate realistic looking fake data, so fake customers. And then I'm using that client to create my post request. So I'm creating a customer, getting a response, validating the response, and so on. And I have a few example tests over here. Nothing really special, nothing out of the ordinary. And if you've taken my DomeTrain course on integration testing, link in the description, then you know all about that. In fact, in the course, I go in much more detail about this very subject. Now, here's where this gets interesting. This is how my web application factory looks. And when I need to run my application, what I need to do is deal with the fact that the application by default will call a real database. It will point to a real database and call to a real database. Now, what you don't want to have is you don't want to have an app settings dot something specific for integration tests, because that is nothing that the application itself should know. So all that logic should be in your integration testing project. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because most people think that what they have to do is replace the built-in provider of EF Core, the Postgres provider in this case, to the in-memory one. And that is so wrong. Let me show you the technique first to understand why it's so wrong. Now, before I move on, I'd like to let you know that we just launched a massive 6-hour course on DomeTrain called From Zero to Hero, Test-Driven Development in C#. That course will take you from knowing nothing about testing and TDD and get you to a point where you fully understand the concept and you have all the technique and knowledge to apply it on any C# code base. It is authored by Guy Ferreira, who has an excellent YouTube channel, link in the description, but he's also someone who I work with personally in my previous company, and I can 100% vouch for him. He really knows the topic, and he actually changed the way I see the topic as well and the way I teach it. I believe it's a must know for any developer, and the first 500 of you can use discount code TDD20 and click the link in the description to claim it at checkout. These do tend to go very quickly, and I don't renew them late. So if you want to buy it, then buy it now. Now back to the video. So here in the configure web host method, I would say configure test services, for example, and I can say services over here. And what this allows me to do is get access to the services registered in my DI container as part of the startup process. So I can say, oh, actually, don't use this service, use this one instead. What this means is that at this point, I can go ahead and say, remove all the services of type DB context options, for example, and the type of context is the DB context. So remove the registered one that's going to call the real database, and then remove the actual DB context. And the reason for that is because I want to add my in-memory one. So what I would do is I would say services.add DB context. So I would use my DB context, and then in the method here I would say use in-memory database. And the way you can get this in-memory database is by using this NuGet package over here called Microsoft.antiframeworkcore.inmemory. So I can say mydb to give it a name, And that is it. A few things I need to do. This is going to be a singleton, so it's maintained throughout the application's lifetime, which means that I have to deal with the fact that my application over here is using this iCustomer service as a scoped service. So for that reason, I have to say services.remove all iCustomer services, and then I'm going to have to re-add it as a singleton. No biggie, but that will solve my problem. And if I do that, then I can go straight into my tests over here and say, hey, just run all the tests, go crazy. And what's going to happen is all of my tests are going to pass successfully. And if I go back and I just try to mess around with them, just to show you that, yes, they are the real tests, I can just change the email to something else that I need to validate, go back, and as you're going to see over here, the test will fail because it is not validating the email correctly. It was Jeffrey Rube 69, nice, and it's not anymore because I changed it. So I have some integration tests with heavy air quotes. Why do I say integration tests? Well, because they're not integration tests, because fundamentally integration tests are checking the integration point. Now you have to keep in mind, what does EF Core doing? It is taking your C#, link, whatever, and it's translating that to some SQL query or some query for some provider, whether that is an RDBMS or Cosmos DB or anything else, it doesn't matter. There's some conversion happening. That conversion is part of the integration point. And also the way this conversion is executed against the database you're using is also part of that integration point. So by you going ahead and saying using memory, you just remove all that block out of your application. And this becomes from an integration test to basically a functional test, or what many people would call a functional test. It is not an integration test at all at this point. Integration tests, you want to translate the query to the real database and you want to use the real database. Now, the reason why many people do this in integration tests is because they think it's very hard to use a real database or a test database for this situation. But as we've seen both in my course, again, link in the description, and in a dedicated video, it's actually not that hard to deal with. There's a few approaches. The first and sort of naive approach, but functional, is to just have a test database running at all times, maybe in your dev environment, maybe in some other environment, and have that be called as part of your testing process. Maybe you need to clean it up after execution or so on, but that will work. You really want to use the real database. The alternative would be to use something like test containers, which we've talked about in the channel, which allows you to just create a database just for your tests and then delete it as part of a Docker container. Let's take a look at that. Now, I've already added in my project the NuGet package test containers for Postgres, and I also have Respawn, which will allow me to reset my database to a clean state per test. So what I'm going to do is not type everything because I've already talked about this in detail in a separate video. So I'm going to paste the code and talk you through it. Okay, so let's see what's changed. So now I have a DB connection here that I'm maintaining to reset the database, and I have an instance of Respawner. I do have a video of this if you want to know more as well in detail. And then I have an object of the PostgreSQL container over here with all the details about running a Postgres container, which is a real database. And then in the bottom over here, I have some configuration to start the container when the tests are starting, create the Respawner instance, and then instructions on how to reset the database and stop the container. Now, in my main test classes, all I have is I'm maintaining the DB reset instance over here. And at the bottom, after every test, I'm doing a reset, and that is it. Now, how do I configure the database in this context to use the real database? Well, I no longer need to remove the iCustomer service because even though it is scoped in the application, it should be scoped in my integration tests as well. So I don't need that anymore. I don't need this to be a singleton, and I don't need to re-add it. So all of that goes away. And then in my use in-memory database, all I'm going to say is use npg SQL, and I'm going to say db container.get connection string. And that is it. I'm just adding my context, and that's going to take care of everything else. So if I go ahead now and I say run all the tests, look what happens. All the tests are going to run and all of them are going to pass. So it's going to take a while, and the reason why it's going to take a while, just a few seconds, is that behind the scenes what's happening is test containers is spinning up a real database, as you can see PostgreSQL over here, to make sure that the tests are running against a real database created just for my tests. If I go back and I say just run again and I go back to Docker, as you're going to see, two containers spin up, the database and then sort of a watchdog container, and then they both go away and I don't have to deal with leftover data. And the idea is that this would also be part of something you would run in your CI/CD pipeline. So if you want to test your code base using EF, do not use the in-memory provider if your goal is to have integration testing. That conversion to that query is integral to actually having proper integration tests. But now I want to know from you, is this a mistake that you were making, and does this make sense now? Just leave a comment down below and let me know. Well, that's all I have for you for today. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, keep coding.